by philosophers and practiced by men who called themselves civilized. This is not a story about individual cruelty. This is a story about how cruelty becomes infrastructure. Good evening. Tonight, we descend into a darkness that began not in chaos or madness, but in the cold logic of empire and profit. Behind the polite language of history textbooks and the sanitized narratives of progress lies a truth written in flesh, sold in markets, and recorded in account books with the same precision used for sugar and tobacco. To understand it fully requires us to confront the uncomfortable reality that what we call civilization has often been built on the systematic destruction of those it deemed less than. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely value the difficult truths we explore here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always remarkable to see who joins us in confronting history's shadows. Silence your notifications. Take a deep breath and prepare yourself. What you are about to hear is not entertainment, it is evidence. You are standing in a port city, 1672. The air smells of salt, tar, and unwashed bodies pressed into wooden enclosures. You are not here by choice. You do not yet know that your body has already been categorized, appraised, and assigned a monetary value based on criteria you will never be told. The men who look at you do not see a woman, they see inventory. This is not the beginning of the story. This is the middle of a system already centuries old. Long before the slave ships crossed the Atlantic in industrial numbers, European travelers had been writing. They wrote journals, they wrote letters, they wrote reports to kings and trading companies. And in those writings, African women began to be described not as human beings with individual lives, but as a category, a type, a resource. The descriptions were not random, they were not mere prejudice, they were economic preparation. Portuguese sailors in the 15th century wrote of women on the West African coast as lascivious, without shame, governed by animal instinct. Spanish missionaries described them as devoid of Christian modesty. Dutch merchants noted their excessive fertility with the precision of livestock dealers. French philosophes who never left Paris cited these accounts in treatises on human difference, turning anecdote into taxonomy. This was not curiosity. This was the construction of a legal and moral framework. If African women could be classified as innately, biologically hypersexual, if their bodies could be framed as existing outside the boundaries of European concepts of virtue, modesty, and innocence, then what was done to those bodies could not be called rape. It could be called nature. It could be called commerce. By the time the transatlantic slave trade became a machinery of empire, the intellectual groundwork had already been laid. The violence that followed was not a breakdown of civilization. It was civilization organizing itself. The slave market operated with bureaucratic efficiency. Women and girls were brought to coastal barracoons, holding pens made of stone and wood, where they waited for ships. Before sale, they were often stripped naked. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was inspection protocol. Buyers examined teeth, skin, muscle tone, and reproductive organs. They checked for scars, for signs of disease, for evidence of previous pregnancies. Auctioneers announced not only age and origin, but fertility. Good breeder, they would say. Strong hips. Has borne 3 children. All survived. These were not euphemisms. These were sales categories, printed in advertisements, recorded in ledgers, taxed by colonial governments. In Charleston, in Havana, in Salvador, in Kingston, the same scenes repeated with legal variation, but structural sameness. Women were made to stand on raised platforms. They were turned in circles. They were touched by strangers who were exercising property rights they had purchased from governments that claimed dominion over continents they had never seen. The records survive. In the archives of insurance companies that underwrote slave ships, in the account books of plantation estates, in the correspondence of colonial administrators, the language is relentlessly administrative. One Negro wench, approximately 16 years, good teeth, suitable for field work and breeding, sold for 90 pounds sterling. No anger in the syntax, no hesitation, just notation. This was not a crime hidden in shadow. This was a crime performed in daylight, recorded in ink, notarized and filed. What happened after purchase was both systematic and invisible. On plantations across the Americas, enslaved women existed in a legal paradox. They had no rights. They could not refuse. They could not testify in court against white men. They could not own their own bodies or their own children, and yet the children they bore were property, valuable property, property that increased the wealth of the plantation without additional purchase. Slave owners understood this arithmetic. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, kept meticulous records of the births among his enslaved population. He noted which women were good breeders. He calculated the economic value of natural increase. He wrote in a letter to another plantation owner that I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. This was not personal depravity. This was economic policy. Across the southern United States, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, plantation manuals advised slave owners to encourage breeding through various means. Better rations for pregnant women, small rewards for live births, the threat of sale for those who did not reproduce. Some estates operated what were functionally breeding farms, where enslaved women were kept primarily for reproduction. The violence of this system was not always loud. It was often silent. It was the slave owner who entered the quarters at night. It was the overseer who exercised what he believed was his right. It was the law that defined rape as a crime against property, not a crime against a person. And since the enslaved woman was property, she could not be raped by her owner. This was not legal theory. This was statute, written and enforced. And when children were born from these acts, they were evidence of crime. They were added value. They carried their mother's legal status. They were born enslaved. They could be sold. There is a letter written in 1834 by an enslaved woman named Harriet Jacobs. She was writing about her grandmother, who had been repeatedly raped by her enslaver. Jacobs wrote, "She had become prematurely old through suffering. Her mind was in a perpetual unrest. The gnawing consciousness that she was not able to protect her children from outrages wrung her heart." This is not a description of physical pain. This is a description of ontological destruction, the systematic erasure of the capacity to be a mother, to be human, to exist as anything other than an object of use. Jacobs herself spent 7 years hiding in a crawl space to avoid sexual assault by her enslaver. 7 years in a space so small she could not stand. When she finally escaped, she wrote not of her own suffering, but of the system that produced it. She wrote, "Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women." Why? Because the violence against enslaved women was not peripheral to the system. It was core infrastructure. Enslaved men could be worked to death. Enslaved women could be worked to death and forced to produce more workers. Their bodies were not only labor, they were reproduction machinery. The medical profession participated. In the 19th century, American physician J. Marion Sims, later celebrated as the father of modern gynecology, conducted experimental surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia. He operated on a woman named Anarcha over 30 times, perfecting a technique for repairing fistulas caused by childbirth. He operated on Lucy, on Betsy, on women whose full names were never recorded. He wrote about these experiments in medical journals. He described the women as willing subjects, but they were enslaved. They could not consent. They could not refuse. Sims knew this. He wrote it openly, and he was not condemned. He was honored. Statues were erected. Medical schools bore his name. This was not one man's cruelty. This was the infrastructure of medical science built on the assumption that black women's bodies were available for use, for study, for experimentation. The knowledge gained from their suffering entered textbooks. It entered medical practice. It entered the unmarked foundation of modern obstetrics. The women were never named in the honors. They were mentioned, if at all, as cases.
After emancipation, the system did not end, it adapted. In the United States, black women were legally free, but economically captive. Sharecropping, convict leasing, debt peonage, each created conditions where refusal was impossible. Domestic workers, isolated in white households, faced sexual violence with no legal recourse. When they became pregnant, they were dismissed. When they accused their employers, they were not believed. The courts reflected this. In case after case, judges ruled that black women could not be victims of rape in the same way white women could, because they were presumed to be naturally promiscuous. This was not folk belief, this was legal precedent. It shaped verdicts, it shaped sentencing, it shaped the architecture of American law. Lynching, often justified as protection of white women, was in fact a tool to enforce this racial sexual order. Black men were lynched for alleged sexual crimes, while white men who assaulted black women faced no consequences. The same mobs that killed black men for accusations ignored or laughed at black women's testimony. This was not hypocrisy, this was system maintenance. The structure required that black women remain outside the category of woman as defined by law and protected by violence. Meanwhile, across colonial empires, the pattern repeated with eerie uniformity. In the Belgian Congo, French West Africa, British East Africa, Portuguese Mozambique, everywhere European powers established rule, they established sexual access. Colonial officials took African women as concubines. The term made it sound voluntary. It was not. Soldiers raped during pacification campaigns. Missionaries preached chastity, while mission stations became sites of abuse. Plantation overseers, mining bosses, district officers, all exercised what they considered a prerogative of power. The children born from these unions were categorized as mixed race, placed in separate legal categories, often taken from their mothers and raised in missionary schools designed to civilize them. The mothers were left without legal claim to their own children. The colonial archives contain occasional scandals. A governor recalled, an officer court-martialed, but these were not systemic reforms. These were PR management. The structure remained. And when African nations gained independence, the sexual violence did not disappear. It shifted forms. Military coups, civil wars, refugee camps, trafficking networks. The International Criminal Court now prosecutes rape as a war crime, but the prosecutions focus on African conflicts while ignoring the centuries of precedent, the legal and intellectual structures that made such violence thinkable, normal, bureaucratic. In 2007, researchers analyzing DNA across the Americas found a genetic signature, a vast traceable pattern of European male ancestry and African female ancestry in populations descended from slavery. The pattern was not random. It was the genetic archive of systematic rape written into the chromosomes of millions of people. This is not a metaphor. This is biology as historical record. The violence was so widespread, so sustained, so structurally embedded that it left a mark in human heredity itself. The researchers published their findings in academic journals. They noted the data. They discussed the admixture. Few used the word rape in the titles. The language remained clinical. Today, the narrative has changed, or so we are told. We speak of human rights. We speak of consent. We speak of gender-based violence as an atrocity. International tribunals are convened. Hashtags trend. Declarations are signed. But the structures remain. Black women are still disproportionately victims of sexual violence in nearly every country where data is collected. They are less likely to be believed. They are less likely to see prosecutions. They are more likely to be criminalized themselves. arrested for prostitution, for drugs, for behaviors framed as deviance rather than survival. In medical research, black women are still understudied, their pain still dismissed, their symptoms still minimized. Maternal mortality rates for black women in the United States are 3 times higher than white women, even controlling for income and education. The explanations shift: genetics, lifestyle, stress. But the result is the same. Their bodies are treated as less valuable, their suffering as less urgent. In immigration detention centers, in refugee camps, in prisons, in informal settlements across the world, women, disproportionately black and brown, remain vulnerable to sexual violence by those in positions of authority: guards, officers, camp administrators. The reports are written, the cases are filed, the system continues. This is not ancient history we have overcome. This is infrastructure we have renamed. The language has improved. The paperwork is more sophisticated. We no longer write "good breeder" in ledgers. We write risk assessments, demographic reports, population health statistics. The categories have changed. The structure has not. We have built monuments to abolitionists. We have apologized, in careful language, for past injustices. We have museums with plaques that say "never again," but the women whose bodies were used to build empires remain largely nameless. The systems that used them have been studied far less than the men who resisted them. History prefers heroes. It prefers revolution. It prefers the moment of rupture. But sexual violence was not a rupture. It was continuous operation. It was policy, procedure, model, profit. And its traces are not only in archives. They are in law, in medicine, in the social structures we inherit and mistake for nature. So, here is the question you must sit with. If a system can operate for centuries, legalized, bureaucratized, profitable, defended by intellectuals, enforced by law, and practiced by men who considered themselves civilized, and if that system can end legally but continue structurally, and if the people who benefited from it never faced justice, never returned the wealth, never dismantled the institutions built on that violence, and if the descendants of the women who suffered are still today suffering disproportionately in ways that precisely echo the original categories, then what do we call the society we live in now? Is it different, or is it simply better at the paperwork?